You're listening to the No Schedule Man podcast with Kevin Bulmer, exploring real stories and lessons learned with a variety of special guests. To learn more about Kevin and to access other episodes of the podcast, please visit noscheduleman.com and connect and contribute at NoScheduleMan on Twitter or Instagram and on Facebook, YouTube, and SoundCloud, all /NoScheduleMan. Thanks for listening and enjoy the No Schedule Man podcast.
I've been known to struggle with reality, not that it is any real mystery.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bulmer. Thanks so much for finding us. I'm really glad that you're here, and I hope that you enjoy the show. Would love to have you on our email list. You can jump on board that at noscheduleman.com. Just look at the upper right-hand corner. All the social media channel links and ways to reach me are listed up there as well. And keep in mind, if you'd like something a little bit shorter, and especially if you're listening to this on YouTube, just click subscribe and you can see the weekly video blogs that we do that are usually only a few minutes in length, and try to get one of those out every Thursday in addition to the No Schedule Man podcast. So just wanted to mention that really quickly. Today, we're going to be exploring the journey of Doug Vincent. Doug, I think, is a pretty incredible human being, and he has been very, very kind to me. I'll expand on that in just a moment. First, I want to give you a little bit of background and an idea of the experiences that Doug has had. Now, I'm not going to go over the complete list, so keep in mind here, these are just some of the highlights, okay, that I have picked out. I'm not going over everything. But to give you a bit of an idea of who you're about to hear, Doug Vincent is a charter member and past president of the Woodstock Oxford Rotary Club. Woodstock Oxford is an area near where I live here in Ontario, Canada, a member of Rotary International. He's a third-generation graduate of his family's successful farm equipment business. He's now an international advisor to family business corporations and focusing on harmony and communications in family business. On top of that, Doug has served as federal RCMP advisor. RCMP is Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He's been on the Ontario Police Review Committee and is the past vice chair of the Ontario Police Services Board. You're starting to get the idea that this is an individual with some pretty varied experience. I'm not done yet. Just a few more highlights. Doug's done a lot of traveling through his work with Rotary and as a global speaker, and on some of the missions that he's gone and helping people with family business. And one of the areas that he has really made a big impact is in the Philippines. And Doug has been appointed an honorary colonel in the Philippine National Police, recognizing his role promoting global understanding, brotherhood, and world peace. Let me just stop there for a moment. Think about how awesome that would feel to have something like that next to your name, especially when you know that's something that can only be earned. And I can absolutely tell you, and you're going to hear for yourself when you hear from Doug in just a moment, he has absolutely earned that. Being recognized for promoting global understanding, brotherhood, and world peace. That's the kind of thing that motivates me. I want to learn to be like that. Doug has traveled the world on Rotary humanitarian aid activities. He's a Rotary representative to the United Nations. He has received several leadership and appreciation awards for the work that he's done, including a President's Citation and the prestigious Service Above Self Award, among many, many others. More recently, he was recognized as a distinguished Canadian with a special Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal. Now, Doug, I know that you are probably listening to this now, and I don't want to suggest that you're embarrassed, but if I know Doug, he's saying he doesn't need to say all that stuff about me. And truly, when you meet Doug, and if you're fortunate enough, as I have been, to share his company, these do sound like a lot of flowery accolades for who comes across as a very humble and very compassionate, very warm and welcoming human being. But these accolades have been offered to him and earned by him because of the fact that he's done as much work as he has and led with so much compassion. He's often called Rotary's Roving Ambassador. He's a past governor, founding co-chair of the Global Rotary Peace Community Program, and is also a Rotary Foundation cadre advisor as well, among, as I say, many, many other things. I could be here for another 20 minutes just going over some of the things that are associated with the history that Doug has accumulated so far. But to me, he's somebody that I have met in my fairly recent travels as I work on the speaking aspect of my business. And so I was fortunate enough to be introduced to Doug through some mutual friends, and right from the very first time that I was fortunate enough to share his company and get to speak with him, I just knew that this was a really special person that I could learn a lot from. And right from that very first moment, he made me feel completely welcome and included and valued and absolutely comfortable in his presence. And you're about to hear why. I'm thrilled to be able to share Doug with you and his collective experience and the wisdom and the insights that he has to offer through all of the experiences that he's had all around the world. And I'm just really grateful to him. I think you're probably getting that idea. He tells some terrific stories and gives us some great background, including going over some of the origins of Rotary. He talks about Rotary's ties to the United Nations, and in fact, of course, I didn't realize about how the United Nations came to be largely because of Rotary. There's a story that he tells that it touched me deeply when we were having the conversation, and I've listened back to it again, and it really got to me. It's about a water turnover ceremony in a little village where he was at one point along his journey. And this was a part of the world where water was not immediately available to them. And in fact, it was a long way away. And I thought about that even as Doug was telling the story, that water is not something that has ever even crossed my mind in terms of whether or not it's available. So when I listened to Doug tell the story, I got into that headspace a little bit of just thinking about what it would be like, how my life would be different if something as what I consider to be as fundamental as a drink of water, or to use it to wash your clothes or your dishes or your hair and your body. So when Doug tells the story about digging the well and making the water available and how the citizens of that community reacted and what they did, just absolutely outstanding. It would be pretty. He talks about coming back to Canada from that pretty charged up and fired up, and you'll be able to tell why when you hear him tell that story. From that to all the way for the beginnings of how he got his start in business, some incredible stories. And I won't retell any of them here. I'll let Doug tell them. But just a few things that I want to point out that I really took away from my time with him to listen for. Number one, I'll call it saying yes to life. Doug goes over a number of stories, including recalling the time in the early 90s when he had a heart attack. Listen for what he says about that and how that changed him and his view of wanting to say yes to more opportunities, and in particular, the commitment that he made of what he wanted to go and do within 30 days after that time. And he did go and do it. But listen for that. And when I heard that, I thought saying yes to life. And when I look upon the experiences that Doug has had through that lens and that filter of wanting to really get immersed in the community, not just here where he lives, but in communities around the world, by saying yes and really getting to know people and diving in and trying to make a difference, I find that really inspiring, and I hope that you do too. Number two, something that Doug said, and indeed I decided to name the episode this: learn to do by doing. He tells some incredible stories about some of the things that he counsels people to do when they are bringing up future generations into the family business. He talks about how he got his start, humble beginnings. All I'll say is hockey sticks, of how he learned, and then how he took that knowledge and was able to pass it along to his kids when he had a side business, and how he empowered them. This comes up when he talks about the humanitarian efforts that he had traveling, and how he likes to go off the beaten path and not really on the tourist trails, and go to where the people are and learn from the person sitting next to you, and learn to do by doing. A great example of that. And number 3, consider the difference that one person can make. And then to take the next step on that, of how that can actually be scaled on a global basis. So near the end of the conversation, you're going to hear Doug talk about how some people will come to him and say, well, I could never do what you do. And he says something to the effect of, well, no, maybe not right away, but I've got a 30-year head start on you. But don't underestimate the difference that one person can make. And then he discusses in this conversation some tools that are available to take that difference that you can make and multiply it and magnify it, and in some cases scale it well beyond what you might have been able to imagine possible. Doug Vincent is living proof that you can do that. If you don't listen to anything else, if you're still with me and you're thinking, boy, this looks like you want me to hang in here for an hour, scroll to the end, like just pull the little, I don't know what they call it, progress bar, slider, whatever, or wherever you're listening on YouTube, iTunes, wherever, over to near the end of the conversation, and listen to the story about the wheelchair. And Doug talking about being in Mexico and the description of the individual and the experience that he had and what that wheelchair meant to him. And also the next level of that, and how more people could have been helped. If you don't listen to anything else, listen to that. But I hope that you'll settle in for all of it, and you're going to hear in just a few seconds and for the next hour why I hold this man in such great reverence and with such great respect, and why I was so grateful and am grateful for this time. So get comfy, settle in as we explore the journey of Doug Vincent on the No Schedule Man podcast. Doug, what led to you initially getting involved in Rotary?
Well, Rotary has a program which has been called Group Study Exchange. It's now called Vocational Training Teams, and it's for young business and professional people to travel to a foreign country on a reciprocal exchange. So usually it's a team of 5 or 6 professionals who are not Rotarians, led by a team leader who is a Rotarian. And back in 1977, I was selected to go on this 6-week exchange to Australia. So that was my initial introduction to Rotary. And when I saw what the Rotarians were doing and the caliber of people who became my friends in Australia, and subsequently when I returned, connected with them here in southwestern Ontario, I think that's where the seeds were planted.
Let's set the stage a little bit more for those that are not familiar with what Rotary fundamentally is and does.
Okay. Rotary is an international service club organization that joins community leaders all around the world, and they come together at weekly meetings to exchange ideas, have speakers talk on anything to do with current affairs or personal growth and development topics. And after we exchange those ideas, we look at ways to do projects to make a difference in the world, in every community in over 200 countries on our globe.
What were the origins of Rotary?
Origins of Rotary were by a chap by the name of Paul Harris in 1905. So we're just a little over 100 years in the making. And his main goal at the time was fellowship and fun and camaraderie, because he was a lawyer who moved to Chicago, didn't have many friends. He gathered up 3 other friends one night, and they went and had dinner somewhere, and they enjoyed it, so they decided to meet again the next week, and they met in a different restaurant, and in some cases they met in each other's offices, so they rotated their meeting location each week, and that's how the name Rotary came about.
Oh, I'd always wondered about that and had never quite looked into it. I appreciate the explanation, and that really gives a nice backdrop to putting us back to where this started for you anyway in 1977 when you were introduced to that in the trip to Australia. What did the rest of your professional and personal life look like at the time? What was going on?
Well, I was in family business with my father and my uncle, and I had the opportunity to apply for this from a local Rotarian in Cambridge, Ontario, who was actually a friend of my father's, and he thought of me when they put the call out for applicants. And so I was able to, there's a several months planning, of course, to go into this trip. And when you're in the foreign land, you're expected to go to people of similar vocations. So partially it was a vocational exchange. We would be expected to go to companies of similar nature to our vocation and give presentations to learn what they do there, different than what we do in Canada. We would visit institutions. We would give presentations there on Canadian culture, the way we do things. Also met with many government leaders and cabinet ministers. So it was a working trip. It wasn't a tourist trip. And so in that process, I guess I was taught some skills by the Rotarian leaders on how to do presentations, how to receive information. And of course, when you come home, you're expected to go out and speak to community organizations, to Rotary clubs, to any of your trade associations that you may belong to through your work. And I guess that also got me started into my professional speaking career, as well as the humanitarian aid service work that Rotary does.
We're going to get into all of that and explore it fully, I'm hoping, here in the time that we've set aside for us. I'd like to set the stage even further of going back to, you mentioned the family business, and I'm curious about diving into, as best as you can recollect, what your thoughts were about the opportunity that became going to Australia. But before we get into that, maybe let's talk about that family business so that people can kind of understand some of the work that you were doing and then represented on your way over there. So it's farm equipment, right?
Yes. Well, I'm a third-generation graduate of a large farm equipment enterprise in southwestern Ontario, started by my grandfather in 1923. And actually, an interesting story is that he, at the time, was working for a blacksmith in the village of Ayr, Ontario, and he saw the future of mechanization coming, or at least he felt it was coming, but the blacksmith employer did not see that coming, had no interest in it. And so my grandfather made a deal with his boss, the blacksmith shop, and he bought all of the primitive parts for some of the walking plows and equipment. And the story goes he pushed the wheelbarrow full of parts up the main street of Ayr right into one of the most successful farm equipment dealerships in Canada, actually, through many years.
How did being around that environment, effect isn't the word I'm looking for, Doug, but what was it like as you were growing up, being around? I'm assuming that your grandfather was still very much involved, and then certainly your father would have been involved if you're the third generation. How did that translate into your experience as a youngster?
Well, of course, as my father would say, I was in the business since I was in diapers. So, and I can remember going to the shop with my dad and my grandfather, who I didn't know well because he passed away in 1955, but I do have recollections of him. And but my father and my uncle took over the business, and of course, like any youngster in a family business, I would go most likely on Saturdays or sometimes after school. And I remember the time we sold actually wagons that the children's jobs would be to put the wagons together. So I was given a kind of a hands-on training in terms of at least simple mechanical skills. And but I think as I look back, my father did mentor me and coach me well, because he allowed me to set up my own little mini business in the showroom of the farm equipment dealership. And I remember selling hockey sticks. And so in our small town of Ayr, there's not a lot of department stores or big box stores in those days, but we would go to the hockey stick factory, which was in Hespeler at the time, and we would figure out what inventory we needed, and he would drive me, and we would come home with a whole bunch of hockey sticks in big bundles. And of course, I had to unpack them and inventory them and price them and display them in a corner of the showroom that was delegated for my little hockey stick business. And so I think right from the early days, he taught me well in terms of the basics of entrepreneurship.
Some people have lemonade stands. You had hockey sticks.
Yes, I did.
Around what age were you when you had that idea?
Oh my goodness, I can't remember. Maybe 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there. But
that young,
I'm guessing.
So from that time, you must have had an idea about what I'll call basic economics of. And here's what's going through my mind listening to you, Doug. I remember my son asking me many years ago about why things were priced the way they were when you go out to buy, well, anything. And he couldn't quite understand where all the money went and who paid whom. So at 6, 7 years age, you were faced with all of that.
Yeah, learn to do by doing. And
yeah.
So if you're in charge of keeping track of the inventory, keeping track of what's being sold, keeping track of the money in the little tin box that you keep it in, and hopefully you've got more money than what you need to pay for the next order of hockey sticks. Absolutely, it was just the mentoring and the coaching. I don't even think I realized it at the time, the valuable lessons I was learning at that point.
Did you approach your dad and say, "I've got an idea, I'd like to sell hockey sticks"?
No, I wouldn't say so. He was very active in hockey. He was a manager of one of the Ontario winning hockey teams, was quite involved in the minor hockey. And so I'm guessing that there was a need that he maybe saw, and he likely presented it as an opportunity. I don't even remember it even being discussed. It just kind of evolved, and it taught me a lot of lessons that I likely didn't realize until much later in life.
The reason why I'm asking is that I think that there's an exhilaration in acting even though you don't know what you don't know. Which you said, learn by doing, right? And it's a spirit that for a lot of people that I talk to, up to and including the one that I see in the mirror every day, has to be reminded of that sometimes, to not expect to have all the answers or be perfect right out of the gate, but to enjoy the exhilaration of letting things unfold. But you've got to first have the idea and then take the action to go to, in this case, the hockey stick factory. Yeah,
I think as a youngster, I wouldn't have that degree of maturity to think at that level. But when you stand back and look at it many years later, more mature, of course, you don't know what you don't know, and you just kind of bootstrap it, is what a lot of entrepreneurs do, and they just take one day at a time. And nowadays I think we have more formal mentorship, more formal business coaching, or even life skills coaching, that there are people who offer their services to today's budding entrepreneurs, so that they can learn by other people's mistakes and at least learn the theory. You got to learn the practical side by making your own mistakes. But I think times are entirely different in business now than they would have been back then.
As you got a little bit older, specifically into your teens and investigating and looking around and doing maybe some of the things that teenagers do, how, if at all, did that affect how you were viewing what you thought might be your future relative to the family business or not?
I don't know that you give a lot of thought to that when you're young. In my case, I wasn't particularly active in sports. I was more active in electronics and building a little shortwave radio, and I was more interested in helping climb around the equipment and getting in the way of the mechanics. Most likely would be their viewpoint on that. But hanging around the shop and doing the odd jobs, and whether it was sweeping or filling the Coke machine, doing a lot of practical things. And I think we all learn by those things. And of course, I always enjoyed jumping in the delivery truck, going out on a trip to deliver a piece of equipment, or going to one of the warehouses to pick up a load of equipment. And so I was always hanging around the shop, doing some stuff. Some may have a different viewpoint on how productive some of it was. And of course, I'm sure I've made my fair share of mistakes and screwed things up as only any youngster in a family business might do. But all in all, it worked out, very well. And when I graduated from college, I was fortunate to be hired and offered a position by one of our main manufacturers, which was International Harvester at the time. So I had a very successful career with them outside the family business before I ever did join the family business.
So you left and came back. Well, not left,
well, I didn't
but
left.
you did something else.
Came out of university, and wearing my family business advisor's hat just for a moment, that's one of the key success strategies that are used, is that basically I would recommend to any father and mother that the son or the daughter go and work somewhere else prior to coming into the family business. And in fact, some families have a code of policy or a code of conduct which would state that any son or daughter coming into the business has to work for another outside organization for X number of years, maybe 2 or 3. Some even contain a clause that they have to have had at least 2 promotions during their tenure with the outside company. So they get to know what it's like to have a boss and to be accountable and responsible. And those sons and daughters who come into a family business then usually have a much stronger foundation when they come and join the family business, because they know what it's like to have a real job, and then they can accept the fact that their father and mother are their bosses that much easier.
That's really interesting. I would think that another benefit of that would be acquiring a perspective of something larger outside that family unit as well.
Oh, of course. You get outside experience, you see how things work. And in my case, I was fairly lucky because I'd known the business from the dealership point of view. Going to work with the manufacturer allowed me to move up the ladder. Like I did kind of the 3-year orientation program in 3 months, because I already knew most of the product. I knew how to run it. And there was times when even with the manufacturer where they would have a trade show, I mean, and of the 10 or 12 people there, I was always the one who was asked, can you operate this or operate that, or can you move this or that, because I had the most experience in terms of the product because of my upbringing at my father and uncle's shop. So, those sorts of things make a big difference in terms of moving someone along if they already know how the product's used and the ins and outs of the product, which I had the fortunate opportunity to have.
How content do you remember being, or not, but I'm sensing maybe some contentment in terms of at each stage, even right from a kid, of being fully present and engaged in what you were doing at that time and just allowing itself to lead to the next, as opposed to maybe did you have a big dream, so to speak, that you were aspiring to get to? Because the sense I'm getting is more that it seems like you just kind of took and have taken each stage as it came to you and made the most of that, and then when it was time for something else to develop, that realized itself. How fair is that as an observation? Is it anywhere close?
Well, I'm not sure I ever knew I'd be a farm equipment dealer. I always wanted to be a country music star, actually.
Okay, well, now we're getting to it.
But I think when I look back, I've learned that a lot of things will evolve in their due time. Yeah. And some people would say who are religious based, there's a divine intervention or there's a plan for you in your life. And I can remember many times where I was impatient. I wanted to get on with it, and like things aren't happening. What are we going to do to make them happen? And some of my friends and some of the relationships I've had have taught me that, just settle back. And even my father, has mentored me in this area that, things will happen if it's meant to happen, and it'll happen in the time it's supposed to happen. And so I guess I've kind of gotten more mellow in my later years that things just kind of fall into place when they're supposed to be. And but I think we all need people in our lives who will help us and give us the even if it's only the emotional strength and resources, because I see so many people in the younger generations that they want to make things happen and they want to do this, and the self-gratification has to be immediate, and they get really frustrated if they don't get this right away, and they want to do it all themselves. And I think younger people maybe need to have a better understanding of the importance of having other people help them along the way, of you help me, I'll help you, of networking is what we would call it in today's business marketplace, that that a lot of things can happen, but if you don't have the network, or if you don't have the friends, and if you don't allow outsiders to give you some help, you're not going to get down the road quite as quick as you would if you availed yourself of friends who are willing to help you and who may have some resources that you can use. Because I really do believe a lot of times it's not what you know, it's who you know. And if these young people don't get off their cell phones and off their computers a little bit better than they have been in recent times, they're going to lose out on those face-to-face relationships. And down the road, they're not going to have that depth of knowledge and stuff that people of your and my generation might have.
Yeah, get out to where the people are. Shake somebody's hand, ask a question, and listen to the answer, huh?
Well, yeah, and that's, there's times, too, when maybe I'm on my cell phone too much, but I try not to be.
We all are.
And we get wrapped up in the technology, but getting out to events and getting to network and know people and show a genuine interest in what they're doing, you can learn a lot by talking to someone sitting next to you, whether it's at a restaurant or in church or at an industry trade meeting or a trade show. You can always learn something by the person sitting beside you.
I forget that I'm talking to 2017 Doug, and so early to mid 1970s Doug might have been a little bit more restless and, as you had said, impatient or ready to get on with it than the guy that I'm sitting across from now. And
well, of course, and my father, again, being very astute, as well as my uncle supporting me, they did me a really, really big favor back in would have been 1977-8, where we had multiple locations, and we pioneered that in our industry. And so they offered me the opportunity, rather than buying into the business with my father and uncle, they offered me a new location that we were going to open. And so my father and uncle said, okay, here's a bank guarantee. We're going to sign it. You go to the bank and you negotiate the money. You go and find a piece of property and buy it. You go and talk to some construction guys, and you get the building built and start the business. And so they gave me, of course, all sorts of background support. And if I fell in the dirt, they helped me stand up and brush my pants off and get going again. And so they taught me by encouraging me to do it myself. And, of course, we shared resources. We shared office and administration services. So I kind of was building my business on the coattails of my father's and uncle's locations. And in hindsight, that was a very wise and astute thing for them to do, is to have me build my own business on my own, so that I can take the pride and grow my business. And from back to a family business point of view, rather than me going into a big business when I maybe didn't have big business skills, this allowed me to start from grassroots, small business, and then my business skills grew at the same time as the business grew. So I think that was a big point that was really, good for me in terms of what I was doing as an entrepreneur.
You mentioned that was around maybe 77, 78. Yeah. Did that happen before or after the initial Rotary trip to Australia?
Just following.
So your world really expanded and accelerated quickly in terms of the new experiences that you were taking in within the course of a couple of years.
Well, of course it did. And I've been in Rotary a number of years, and now I'm a United Nations representative traveling the world on speaking assignments and humanitarian aid project assignments. And at the time, I didn't realize the magnitude of the Rotary world, 1.2 million members in over 200 countries. But even in the little community that I moved to start this new business, they knew of me because of being on the exchange, and they were always inviting me to come and speak or to report on the exchange. If they ever had an exchange coming into town, they always included me to be with those people or help host them. I learned a lot from sitting beside a bank manager for lunch, or we do makeups. We can go to any city in the world, and we're expected to go to a Rotary meeting. And I remember going to Vancouver once. I sat down beside the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia, who was a Rotarian, there for lunch. I can remember going to Toronto and sitting beside the Vice President of the Bank of Montreal. And those are networking opportunities. And even just in a dinner conversation, or subsequently later working on a Rotary committee with those guys, to see how they would manage themselves, to see how they would operate, being chairman of a committee. When I look back, I learned a lot from those senior leaders in the business world. And I have to thank every one of them for the little bits that I learned observing them and working with them on committees. And I think we don't share that benefit very much when we're talking to prospective Rotary members.
At the time that you went to the exchange in Australia, had you been off the continent prior to then?
I had been I'd done some traveling. I was in a band once that went to Europe. My uncle had a long-distance trucking operation. I drove part-time truck with him during my school days, which included Mexico and all across the U.S. and Canada. And I had been on family holidays as well. So I had some travel experience and have always enjoyed the travel. That's
twice now. I bet the band was a country music band.
Actually, it wasn't.
No.
It was a kind of a brass and woodwind orchestra band.
What did you play?
I played the cornet.
Do you still play at all?
No.
If I gave it to you, would you be able to figure out?
I might get a sound out of it, but I don't know that I could.
So, okay, a little bit of a diversion, but this music has come up twice, and you're smiling big whenever it does come up. So, how did Coronet come into being? And no, I won't ask a two-pronged question. Coronet, was that something that came to you through your schooling?
I think I don't really remember, but they had a local community band, and some of my friends were in it, and I expressed an interest. And I don't think there's a reason that I was assigned the cornet or that I picked it. It was likely an instrument that they had available, and that could be the reason. I'm not sure.
But country music is something that you've always loved.
I'm a country music fan, and I, in fact, one of my good friends who's a country music star, Gordy Tapp, just passed away recently.
Yeah.
And he, as many know, was a writer and a performer on Hee Haw. And so we had many belly laughs and many tours of the Grand Ole Opry backstage or fishing on his boat. And so through him, I also had some additional really, really neat country music experiences.
Who were some of the artists that you really admired back in that time?
Oh, I think Buck Owens was one of my fans at the time.
He's the one who stands out?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
I got a story about meeting Johnny Cash.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he played at the Western Fair here. This would have been, I think, in the early 90s. I was working as a stagehand at a talent search stage, and this was when they used to do the regular grandstand shows, and they brought us backstage. At that, I guess Johnny had done two sets, and we caught him in the break. And Doug, one of the fellows that was with me, grew up in a house where Johnny Cash was God, as far as they was concerned, and he was just literally physically shaking. and I was too young to know really have the context of who I was really meeting. And he came over to me, and with the voice of God, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," and shook my hand. Yeah. And my friend Matt was shaking, and he was saying, "Mr. Cash, it's such an honor to meet you. Is there any way that I could possibly ask you for an autograph to give to my father?" And he said, "Well, of course. Do you have something to sign?" And my friend Matt went into a panic, and he was frantically searching. He had a pair of cargo pants on, and in the side pocket of the cargo pants, he actually pulled out one of those little pocket-sized Bibles. This is I couldn't make this up. And it was the only thing that he had. Didn't have a napkin. There wasn't a piece of paper nearby, but he had the little pocket-sized Bible. Yeah. And he sort of somewhat reluctantly handed that over to Johnny Cash. And in the inside, I don't know if they're still this way, but the very first page is where the national anthem is written.
Okay.
And so Johnny took that, and he took a pen, and he wrote down, God bless Johnny Cash.
Oh, good for him.
And so we laughed ever since that time that my friend Matt's probably got what we called the only autographed copy of the Bible.
Yes, I would suggest that's likely true.
Yeah, and if you're going to get an autograph for that, who better than somebody with that voice? Thank you for indulging me that diversion, but those stories can run deep, don't they?
Oh, you always remember that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Australia. I want to go back kind of to where we started. What were your recollections of being there and applying some of the things that you had learned in the family business and your other experiences as well, and working with people in an entirely different country on those issues? What do you remember from that time?
Well, I think, number one, Australia was much, much larger than I first thought it was. it's 7/8 the size of USA. So if you're flying from Sydney to Perth, it's kind of like going from New York to Washington, or New York to Washington State or Seattle. And so the size, I think, was the first thing. I think the second was the friendliness of the people. And they're hospitable in nature. They're warm and friendly. In fact, while our formal tour was in the Western Australia Perth region, the Rotarians from Sydney, when they heard we were coming, they said, come a week early and we'll host you in Sydney, because it's stupid for you to come all this way and not see the eastern part of the country. So, I mean, they hosted us for a week and toured us around prior to our official exchange in Perth. And I think the other thing was that Australia is geographically very similar to Canada in that a lot of the trade and commerce, a lot of the population are around the east and west coast and along the bottom of the country. And the center and upper portion of the country, similar to Canada, is relatively barren. And so that was kind of interesting, that there's a lot of similarities. And then I think another big difference, that in Canada and the U.S., we take it for granted if we need a part for our car, if we need a part for our washing machine, we can usually expect to have it, within the next day or two or three. But in their particular case, if the supplier in Australia doesn't have that part, I mean, they got to wait 6 weeks for it to come from America or Europe. And so our kind of immediate need to get something fixed with a replacement part doesn't work very well there when they've got a longer distance from which those items would have to be shipped from.
So another part to letting the process play out and sort of the patience in it that almost harkens back in my mind to some of the earlier parts of the conversation. That was likely a really valuable perspective for you to see.
Well, it was. And the fun and the fellowship, and like even to this day, that was back in 1977. I've been to Australia several times to visit those friends who I made. Many have passed on now. But for example, I was on a speaking tour in Australia last year, and I give a speech to Rotary on this, and that I traveled for 1 month in Australia, and I never had one hotel bill. I traveled a month for free, essentially, other than buying my host family's lunch or dinner and buying some souvenirs. I went from one point to the other. The Rotarians would drive me from one town to the next, and I'd stay there a couple of days and do my little dog and pony show, and they would tour me around, and then we go on to the next town, and that would have been a youth exchange student that I would have hosted from Rotary many years ago. We've always kept in touch, and we would catch up with her and her husband and her family, and then we go on to another location. So that sort of experience grew roots that have grown into big trees today. In fact, one of the things that led me into my consulting and speaking was a heart attack in 1993, where I was at a Rotary convention in Melbourne. We had visited actually an exchange student. Her husband was in the travel business, and we went to Sydney, and I had a heart attack in Sydney. And it was the Rotarians who took care of me. And, of course, when you're booking flights, I mean, I'm ready to go home. I'm feeling great, but the doctors didn't agree. And so, I mean, every 2 or 3 days we were changing the flights. And it was thanks to the husband of a Rotary exchange student. He could go into the computer and change the flights anytime he wanted, without any hassle from a girl on the phone wanting to charge you $360 or whatever. And I was in Australia recuperating for 6 weeks, and then we worked our way back home. And when I was in my hospital bed, I remember thinking to myself, or not saying to myself, oh, damn, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. And at the time, I had people inviting me to go speak and do some consulting work, because our business had been written up in many trade journals and industry magazines as being cutting edge in our industry. And I did some work even for the Farm Equipment Trade Association in the North American Equipment Dealers Association. So I was always being asked either to host a tour or to go and talk to somebody or share with that. So that's kind of what got me going down the speaking and the consulting advisory route. So when I came home from my recovery to Canada, I decided, you know what, I'm going to try and start saying yes to as many of those invitations as I can. Many of them were global. And also I had always dreamt of having a little RV motorhome. And I promised myself in that hospital bed that when I got home, if I got home, I was going to own one of those within 30 days. And a week after I was home in Canada, I was driving down the road, and I saw a little cute RV for sale on a lot. And I went in, and within like 2 or 3 days, I owned it. And I started traveling, doing some consulting work, speaking at events. And at that time, I was very lucky because I had a really good staff. I had said to the staff, I'm only going to be here, half time from now on, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I got my life to live and lots of invitations, and I don't want to miss out. And I had some really good staff. 3 of the department heads came together and formed a management committee. So they were really well-skilled, committed and loyal employees. And my father was retired from the business at that time, but he still had an interest. So he was there to give them psychological comfort that if the building burnt down, they'd have somebody to phone in the family. And so my dad, was very supportive. And that's kind of how I got into the speaking and family business advising role.
What were some of the first few places you took that RV?
Well, I usually, one was St. Louis, Chicago, Dyersville, Iowa would have been 3 of them. And I think there was 4 stops on my first trip. And they were each, tried to plan them 2 or 3 days apart so I can stop along the way and enjoy smelling the roses, so to speak.
It's interesting that you would want to do that and find a joy in being on the road and going to those places inside the continent, while at the same time you said wanting to say yes to a lot of those global opportunities as well. I'm almost hearing that you just really were recognizing that you were enjoying just that genuine experience of discovery and human connection.
Well, yes, and also keep in mind I still had, a couple of children at home, and I still had a business to at least be responsible for, because I'm the guy the bank manager called. Sure. When there was an issue. It kind of mixed in with that. I had a hobby of toy collecting, die-cast collectibles, and so I started a company called Tiny Toys as a kind of another company that built out of my hobby, really. And so that actually, I ran it kind of in conjunction with the farm equipment industry. And so we often would stop in at big toy meets and flea markets and stuff. And then through that toy company, I did the same with my kids as my father had done with me with the hockey sticks. So we would go to a big toy show event, kind of like a flea market, and they would be learning the inventory control and packing and unpacking and making sure the change was right. And I always usually let them, deal with the customers as appropriate. And so they got, lessons on entrepreneurship from me, the same as I did from my father.
You seem to have a natural curiosity, a growth mindset, people might say.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit of a nomad when it comes to travel. I'm not a good tour group person. I'm used to going, if you're going to take me to a city, I'm used to going down, not the tourist street. I'm used to walking up a block and going down the street where the real people live. Yep. And that way you can get a Coke for 50 cents instead of $2.25. And so it's, and I'm fortunate that my wife speaks 5 languages, so she keeps me out of trouble that way.
Well, and I would say meet real people as opposed to being sold something necessarily, right?
Absolutely. And that's the reason with the RV. You're going down the road, or you're in a restaurant having lunch and you're reading a newspaper, or you see a bulletin board with something on it, and it's, it's within your time restraints, or it's within, the distance. And many a times we stopped at a street festival or a concert or a park, just kind of on a spur of the moment impulsive guy. So The RV allows me to and my wife, who also enjoys that, to be impulsive and be kind of nomadic in nature. I try to do that abroad as well, but understand when I'm traveling abroad, I'm usually home hosted by either a United Nations colleague or a Rotary colleague, and my goodness, they take you and show you everything they can. And some days you just wish you could put your feet up and have a hot dog instead of going to another dinner. But they do want to make sure you see everything. But when you're driving somewhere and you've got an appointment to be somewhere, it's not the same as being able just to pull over and stop when you see something. It's I'm kind of living the dream, I guess some would say.
Where did the association with the RCMP come into play?
Well, I don't know if people know how policing works in Ontario, but we have police commissions, and now they're called police service boards, and they are kind of the citizens' police over the police. So the concept is that a municipal police chief or an OPP detachment commander would report to one of these police commissions or police service board, and like a president of a company would report to a board of directors.
Gotcha.
So the idea is that citizens would, they don't get involved in the day-to-day policing, but they would get involved in governance issues, usually dealing only with the chief and the deputy chief. Would be budgeting issues, how many cruisers have we got, what are we going to replace, what are our staffings, and there are adequacy standards put out by the government, and so the police service board or the commission is responsible to make sure that the policing service has the adequate resources to do the job that they're dictated to do. And so one day, it was a friend of mine through Rotary who was a judge. He called me up and said, I want to have lunch with you. And he said, there's an opportunity and I think you're the perfect fit. And typically on these police commissions, there are 5-member boards. 2 are appointed by the cabinet, so they're political in nature. 2 are appointed by the municipalities. So in this case, there was 8 municipalities. So those 8 municipalities would each suggest who would go on, but usually it was 2 mayors would go on, and then they would rotate through those 8 municipalities. And then the 5th person was what they called a community representative. And so he was sharing with me that often with 8 municipalities, it would be hard to get a consensus on who the right person is to represent all 8. And so he said to me, you're well known in the community through your business, through your Rotary, and your knowledge of the whole region is vast. And he said, I think you would be a perfect fit for this opportunity. If you would let me submit your name, I would love to recommend you. And all I need is, your CV and a bit about you so I can submit it. So through a selection process, I was selected to do that. And so then I was doing that for a while, and then I got involved with the OAPSB, which is the Ontario umbrella over all the police boards. And so I got involved in the leadership of the policing group provincially for a while. And then all the while I was dealing with a toy collector with my toy business who was out west, and we became good friends through the toy collecting. And it wasn't for a while that we both realized that he was working for the RCMP as an officer out west, and I was working with law enforcement in Ontario, which was the second connection that we had.
Gotcha.
Fast forward to him getting a promotion to Ontario and in a leadership role. And so I started working with him a bit. And the role that I filled there was that I was finished my Ontario Police Board work, and many people don't understand that the RCMP does all the policing in all the provinces except Ontario and Quebec. And so when the RCMP come to Ontario, sometimes their policies and procedures and their culture is a little bit of a misfit because they're not used to having to deal with the OPP and the municipal police forces because they usually do it all in the other provinces. So he asked me if I would be interested in coming on as an advisor and basically to help the RCMP integrate into community policing in a proactive way rather than a reactive way, and to try and break down the silos with the other police agencies. Of course, being a police commissioner, I knew many of the municipal chiefs. I knew many of the OPP commanders. So, it was a good fit with my contacts and my background knowledge being on the ground in the governance of law enforcement. So he applied for me to be appointed as a federal community policing advisor, which was, I guess at the time and still is, the only one in Eastern Canada. And so my role is just to help the RCMP get integrated into community policing a little bit better. For a while I was involved with Red Surge Duty, where if you want an RCMP officer to come for Canada Day Parade or a Remembrance Day service, then I would help facilitate that sort of stuff. And we got involved in the community outreach programs like Racing for Drugs, that was originally an RCMP program, funded a lot by it. But the last year or two, the budget has just almost dried right up. There's very little money anymore for community policing with the RCMP, which is very, very unfortunate.
For the benefit of anyone listening that's outside of Canada, I'll just mention OPP is Ontario Provincial Police. We're in Ontario, Canada, Doug and I, and the RCMP is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, more of the federal or the national level. What are some of the things from that time and those experiences, Doug, that come to mind as particularly rewarding for you?
Well, I think one of the big I'll say perks that I had with that is I was dealing with senior level law enforcement officers. And again, as I had learned with sitting side by side with Rotary leaders, I could see sometimes the things not to do, and I could see poor leadership, and then I could see really good leadership. And quite frankly, sometimes what you see is people getting elevated or promoted to their first level of incompetence. That could be with the RCMP. It could be with me having a farm equipment mechanic, and he's a really super duper mechanic, and so he's first in line tenure-wise to become a service manager. But he may not have the skills to be a service manager and lead others and work with customers. His skills still remain with the wrench in his hand, and so it's really a challenge. And I've often seen where people are just promoted to one job beyond what they're good at, and quite frankly, often, if the people are honest, it's one job beyond what they enjoy. And so that would be one thing that I would have learned. The other one would be dealing with all the internal politics of government, and someone in Ottawa sitting at a desk in RCMP headquarters or any other corporate headquarters in any town you want to name, thinking that they know more about an issue than the people who are in the field standing in front of it. And I know I can be very outspoken and verbal at times. Some of my friends would say I'm very direct and I shoot straight. Some of my other friends would say, yeah, but you know what? You're a guy who gets things done. And we know that you can make things happen. So that's one of the ways you're able to do it. It's okay, carry on the way you are. And I've been in situations where I've spoken out at, I've done some consulting in big family corporations, and I've chewed out some people during a management meeting, and I can remember one time I walked into the washroom with just either before or after the top dog boss who was there observing the meeting. I mean, he was 2 or 3 levels up in the hierarchy, and I said to him, kind of as a joke, I said, I don't know if I spoke out too much or not, but I said, maybe you're not going to want me back anymore. And he just kind of laughed, and he never commented. And about 3 weeks later, I got a phone call from his secretary, and she said, I'm so-and-so's secretary, and she said, you spoke at one of their regional meetings, training meetings, 3 weeks ago, and Mr. So-and-so was there, and he thinks they need to hear a lot more of what you got to say, and he's wondering if you can come and speak at the annual convention. So that was a big surprise.
That's It's interesting for me, since you and I just got to know each other fairly recently, Doug, to hear all this context, and I appreciate you being so detailed with it, and it makes me even more curious to ask what the story was behind how you ended up as a Rotary representative to the United Nations then.
Well, because I like travel, and because I didn't say that I skipped over the fact that I went on a second GSE trip to the Philippines in the early 90s. Okay. In the meantime, I had joined Rotary, so I was going as the group leader.
Okay.
Because only one person can be a Rotarian as the leader. The rest are not allowed to be in Rotary. So that really opened my eyes up to the world of, people living in dark corners of despair. And, as a Rotarian, we go in there and we try and shine a light of hope and compassion onto those people. And so I saw several examples of that. And, I saw the strong belief that they have in their religion, the strong connections they have with their family. And I can remember being asked to go and officiate at a water turnover ceremony where Rotary had drilled a water well in this little shantytown community that prior to that day, the mothers had to walk an hour and a half each way to carry pails of water on their head. And I can remember walking up this little pathway, and a lady came to me and offered me a little tray of cookies. And she said, "May the Lord bless you, sir." And I wasn't doing anything. It was nothing to do with me. I just happened to be the guy wearing the Rotary jacket. I was the Rotary logo representing the service club there with the local clubs. But, of course, being from Canada, I was kind of the VIP. And I remember standing around that well and pumping water and handing out glasses of water to the children. And then part of the program included prayers. And the prayers were such that, like, please, Lord, let us enjoy this water and let us not be greedy and take more than our fair share of the water. And please help us be respectful of the needs of our friends and neighbors when it comes to the water and taking care of the pump so that it'll pump properly and it won't be broken by someone using it inappropriately. So it was like a dedication ceremony in Canadian standards. They call it a turnover, where Rotary was turning it over officially to the little municipality or the little shantytown. But it was more of a dedication ceremony with prayers offered. And I thought, my goodness, this is really emotional. It really tugged me that day. And then I saw other cases where there was a feeding program or a nutrition program, other cases where there was a need for a medical clinic, and even just some simple medications that, my goodness, I would have had enough money in my pocket to buy what they needed. But somebody dying from, say, diarrhea or the flu because they got dehydrated and there was no medications to do that and to treat them properly. So, of course, when I came home, I was cranked up, and you cannot go through that sort of thing. And you just take what you see on television and all these people wanting handouts and multiply it by 10 because you can smell it, you can smell it, you can feel it, you can embrace it. And the way those children look at you and admire you, the smile of a child is my reward, quite frankly. And so I came back, and anybody who would listen, I was telling them all about what we had to do. And my Rotary leaders at the time said, well, you should speak at our upcoming conference and do this and that. We had a whole bunch of projects going like within about 2 or 3 months, and we have a grant program, a matching grant program. It's called Global Grants, where if a club in a poor country wants to do a project, we match them with a good club in America or Europe or the South Pacific. They match up, and then Rotarians will match the money that those clubs raise, and we can also at times get funding from the matching funding from the Canadian government if it meets the right criteria. So if you give me $1, I can get another $1 from the local Rotarians. That's $2, and then I can get $2 from the Global Foundation, that's $4. So I can match you 4-1. And if it meets the criteria for the Canadian government, I might even get another $3 on top of that. So I can multiply it up. Where else as a charity can you multiply your money and you get it back? And where else can you give your money to a charity where you can determine in the future where it goes? And I can actually take you and let you pump water out of that well that you helped sponsor. That's what Rotary does. No other agency can do that I'm aware of. And so I came back, cranked people up. They got me speaking about it. 2 years later, I took a friendship exchange back to the Philippines of Rotarians. And it's kind of like a GSE for Rotarians, but Rotarians pay their own way. And by the way, all of the Rotary work is done by volunteers. None of us get paid. We all pay our own airfares and everything when we go on these humanitarian projects. So nobody gets a free ride. We went there, and I think it was about 14 Rotary friends and their spouses with me, and we toured all those projects that we had done in the intervening 2 years and showed them where their money was spent. And my goodness, it just blew their socks off. And so I just got immersed in what we call international service. Of course, we do community service at home, but when you think of it, all of our Rotary clubs are doing projects in their home communities, but we're just scaling on a global basis. All Rotarians are doing community service work, and we're scaling it on a global basis. And so I got immersed in international service and speaking, and then I was at a senior level leadership conference, and we were talking about the United Nations and how we're not sharing our UN partnership very well with Rotary. I mean, even Rotarians, many Rotarians don't even know that it was 49 Rotary members who helped form the United Nations in 1945. It was 3 Rotarians who negotiated the land where the UN headquarters is situated, and they talked John D. Rockefeller into donating that property. I mean, Rotary is at the roots of the UN, and there's a whole long story that I don't know if we've got time to tell, but the idea was we aren't sharing the knowledge with anybody in terms of public awareness of our partnership at the UN. But the reason Rotary has official status at the UN is because we helped start it. And if you read the charter of the UN, and if you read the goals and objectives to Rotary, they mean almost the identical thing. And when you think of it, why wouldn't they? Because it was a Rotarian in South Africa who wrote the first charter of the UN. And when you go to the United Nations and look at the first charter where all the delegates signed, they're very proud to point out all the signatures of the United Nations original charter delegates who were there and Rotarians. And so I was walking out of this room, and one of the senior leaders said to me, "You know what? We need somebody who's a good presenter, who understands international service and travels internationally, and we need you to be one of our guys to promote the UN Rotary partnership. We already have official UN representatives at every United Nations facility. So in New York, we have 3 or 4 representatives that are responsible for the local meetings. We have them in Geneva. Anywhere there's a U.S. facility, we have United Nations representatives. I'm kind of the floater guy who really at the zone level was asked to try and do more things, include some stuff on the United Nations in your presentations. And they said, "Is that something you'd be willing to do?" And they gave me a little bit of a budget to work on, which doesn't even cover, anything about, what I run into budget-wise. But that's kind of how I got started. Long answer, sorry.
No, don't be sorry. That's why I asked. An interviewer appreciates when you get more than "it was great," or yes or no. So I try not to lead people down that path, other than some sort of, and I'm not being facetious here, Doug, interplanetary association or something like that. Your story has progressed step by step to just expand and expand and expand and affect and empower other people in other communities with compassion, as you said, and shine those lights. If you view the earth as not a constraint, but as our current landscape with which to work and build a life, I wonder what it feels like for you to look at what you've done so far and consider not just the experiences that you've had and the people that you've met and the friendships that you've made, but the significance that you've lived as well. How does it feel when you think about that?
Actually, this is going to be kind of a reverse feeling that I have, quite frankly.
Okay.
I get really, really, really frustrated when people don't see the difference they could make in a very simple way. For example, I'll give you a case where, obviously when I go and speak, in my family business work, I obviously have a fee, but for the most part, my Rotary work is as a volunteer. And often you get a gift or some sort of thing. So the best example I've had is I was given a gift one time, which was a certificate representing a wheelchair. And they were giving money to a wheelchair agency to give wheelchair to people who needed them. And you have to understand that I have been in countries, and I've been in the dirt in Mexico, where someone came up on a hunk of plywood with a couple old roller skate wheels underneath. And I've helped pick them up out of the dirt and set them in their new wheelchair. That has a profound effect on your heart. It has a profound effect that you've truly made a difference. And you've given that person more than a set of wheels. You've given them dignity. You've given them independence. You've given them freedom. But most of all, you've given them pride. And one man told me one day what that meant to him. And what it meant to him was that he could now get off his bed or the couch that he had been previously confined to because he couldn't go anywhere. And he told me so proudly that tomorrow morning he was going to hit the pavement and he was going to go and find a job so he could help his wife be a breadwinner for his family. And up until that moment, he had been confined to either his bed or the couch in his home while his mother and wife went out to work, and usually one of the kids stayed around the house in case he needed something. So the pride and the dignity and the freedom that that wheelchair gave him, okay, for whatever it was, $150, made a significant difference. And I knew all that. And the people who gave me the donation knew all that. But what they didn't know or didn't do was they didn't use the multiplication factor of Rotary. So had they taken the time to fill out a matching grant, they could have put that 150 into the grant, matched it to 300, matched it again to 600, and we could have given 4 wheelchairs through a Rotary grant program rather than just giving it away to a wheelchair agency. So what I see in a case like that is I see the 3 people that could have been helped and weren't, rather than the one that was helped. And so one of the things that I look at is, we have training programs. I speak on Rotary Foundation and the giving and these grants. And I said to some of my other leaders who also speak on this, we're not getting through. It's not their fault. It's our fault because we are not communicating well enough and training them well enough to put the money through our Rotary structures, our Rotary processes, and get 4 times at least bang for our buck. And they didn't know any different. As soon as I, at a later time, talked with the president, he was so excited to learn that process. And so that's one of my, in a way it's a frustration, but that's what I think about. I think about when I see opportunities and we didn't use the tools that we have and we could have helped way more people than what we did. That's, I guess, where I go for. And I'm not the guy who does all this. I'm a conduit. When you're speaking at conferences, when you're visiting projects, you meet a lot of people and you have a big network. And so I kind of help connect people and tie loose ends together. So I can't take credit for doing all this. It's the Rotarians around the world who do this. Sure, I'm the guy who shows up in the Rotary, T-shirt and helps facilitate some of this, but I can't take credit for a lot of this. It's It's the Rotarians who go out and do the fundraising. It's the people in every community around the world who make a difference. The people make a difference when they give to Rotary. And I just help facilitate that. I try and inspire and motivate where I can. And I do hope that people don't think that, my goodness, I could never do what you do. Well, you can't at the start, but I've been doing this 30 years. Okay, so I got a 30-year head start. So I hope people don't think that they can't do the same thing as I can. And in fact, I had a book publisher talk to me, and I started out, was Rotary wanting me to write a book. And then at a conference, this book publisher came and said, we want to do this book. Would you consider it? I said, well, actually, the Rotary communications people have been after me to do a book. And I started talking about it, and he said, no. He said, I don't want this to be a Rotary book. Rotary's okay, and Rotary can be in it, because Rotary is the vehicle you use to do it. But he said, the book is about what you did, tell us how you did it, and tell the reader how they can do it too. They could maybe do it through a Rotary club. They could do it through a Lions club, a Kinsman club, a Kiwanis club, or their church group, or their school group. Okay? Anybody could use their own vehicle. But he says, I want you to do the book saying what you did, how you did it, and how they can do it too. And you can mention your vehicle was Rotary, but they can replace Rotary with church group, Boy Scouts, anything they want. So that's, I guess, one of my bucket list things that I got to work on. But I got to learn to stay home long enough to accomplish that.
No matter where you are, what club, what organization, it all starts with that first trip to the hockey stick factory, right?
Absolutely.
Just get out and get her started. Huh? Doug, this has been an absolute pleasure for me. You've just been so kind and generous with your time since I was fortunate enough to be introduced to you, and you've given me so much great insight as to why I've appreciated every single second that I just get to be around you and try to learn as much as I can. And thank you very sincerely for sharing this time with me. I hope it's the first of many conversations.
Oh, for sure. There's nowhere to go but up. And it's been great to share this time with you, as it has been some of the meetings we've been at. And hopefully we can continue to learn each other. And by the way, get you involved in a Rotary Club somewhere around town soon.
I'd love to. Thanks, Doug. If you'd like to connect with Doug and learn more about him, you can do so online at dougvincent.com. Now, it's spelled just like how you probably think it might be, but I'll spell it for you just the same. Doug is D-O-U-G, and his surname is spelled V-I-N-C-E-N-T, dougvincent.com, and you can get an idea of all of the different accolades that have been heaped upon him, and for good reason. He's been doing and is doing, and I'm sure will continue to do, terrific work wherever he happens to be around the world. And as far as that goes, I know Doug is very passionate about Rotary and the work that they do. You heard a little bit about that. And if you would like to look into Rotary, learn more about them, their causes, their programs, and how to get involved, you can do that online at rotary.org, www.rotary.org, rotary.org, rotary.org, and I'm sure that they would love to be able to hear from you and have you contribute in the community where you are as well. Now, if you like this episode, I'm guessing that you're probably going to like a few of them. Episode 8, go back and listen to that. Alfredo Kershaw, who is the artistic director of a festival, a world music festival here in Ontario, Canada, called Sunfest. Alfredo was faced with having to leave his home country of Guatemala at one point, and tells what I thought was a fascinating story of having to get assimilated in an entirely new part of the world, and it wasn't always easy. And then his love of music took him back around the world, which he then continues to bring back to Ontario, Canada. Fascinating story, and listening to Doug made me think of Alfredo, who is just another absolute shining light of a human soul. I encourage you to go and listen to that, episode 8. It's called The Incredible Power of Music to Cross All Cultures. On the business side of things, with Doug talking about building family business, if you like that aspect of stuff, go back and listen to episode 10 with David Cicerelli, the founder and CEO of Voices.com. It's called Building a Global Business and Brand. So learn to do by doing. David tells some terrific stories about how they were just kind of woodshedding it together. You know, they didn't know what they didn't know, so they were just taking that next step. And I think Doug would probably get a kick out of some of those stories too. And as far as shining a light and showing compassion and caring and making a difference in your community, and one person making a difference, I automatically thought of my friend Cornell Thomas. You can hear his story in episode 41, The Power of Positivity. Go give that a listen as well. I think that you'll enjoy that. You can find all of those, all of the archived episodes at noschedulemanpodcast.com, or they're all on iTunes as well. You can reach me at kevinbulmer.com. noscheduleman.com will take you to the same place. All my social channel links are up there in the upper right-hand corner of the website, as is the sign-up for our email list. I would love for you to join me on this creative journey and add your voice to mine. And thank you so much for spending this time with me and with Doug. I appreciate you listening, and I hope you'll join me next week on the No Schedule Man podcast.
Just a little deja vu.